Have you ever sat there, phone in hand, staring at a message you know you should reply to, feeling this heavy, dragging guilt just for wanting to leave it on read? Not because you're heartless, not because you don't care, but because some quiet, exhausted part of you has finally started asking a question you've been avoiding for years. What if I don't owe this person my time anymore? And the second that question forms, something strange happens. It doesn't feel like relief right away. It feels like fear. Because if you're an empath, if you've spent your whole life reading rooms, absorbing moods, showing up for people who barely show up for themselves, choosing peace over obligation doesn't feel like self-care. It feels like betrayal. And today, we're going to unpack exactly why that feeling is a lie your own conditioning has been telling you for years. Because here's what almost nobody talks about when it comes to empaths. We treat sensitivity like it's just a personality trait, like being an empath is just a slightly more emotional version of being a nice person. But that's not what's actually happening under the surface. Empathy, real empathy, the kind that lets you feel someone else's pain like it's your own, is wired into the nervous system. It's not a choice you make in the moment. It's a response that fires before you've had a chance to think. And for a lot of empaths, that wiring got shaped early, often in environments where being tuned in to other people's emotions wasn't just helpful, it was necessary for survival. Maybe you grew up needing to read a parent's mood before you walked into a room. Maybe you learned that keeping the peace meant staying hyper-alert to everyone else's needs before your own. Whatever the origin, the pattern that gets built is the same. Your worth becomes tied to your usefulness to others, and obligation stops feeling like a choice. It starts feeling like the price of being loved. So let's talk about what obligation actually looks like when you're an empath, because it rarely looks dramatic. It looks like saying yes when your whole body is screaming no. It looks like answering the call at 11 at night because what if they need you and you weren't there? It looks like absorbing someone else's crisis as your own emergency, dropping everything, rearranging your entire week, while quietly resenting it and then feeling guilty for the resentment. It looks like staying in conversations, relationships, and commitments long after they've stopped serving you, because leaving feels selfish. And selfish is the one thing you have spent your entire life terrified of being. And here's the part that really needs to be said clearly, because I think a lot of empaths have never heard it framed this way. Obligation is not the same thing as love. Obligation is fear wearing love's clothing. Real love can hold a no. Real love can survive a boundary. But obligation panics the moment you even consider stepping back, because obligation was never actually about the relationship. It was about avoiding the unbearable feeling of being seen as someone who let another person down. That fear is so deeply wired into a lot of empaths that they will choose chronic exhaustion, resentment, and self-abandonment over the temporary discomfort of disappointing someone. Let that sink in for a second. Disappointing someone, a completely normal, unavoidable part of being a separate human being with your own limits, has been treated by your nervous system as more dangerous than burning yourself out completely. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this is usually not a sudden realization. It's a slow accumulation. Most empaths don't wake up one day and decide to choose peace. They arrive there after years of quietly running on empty, after one too many times of being the one who gives and gives, while somehow always being the one who ends up apologizing. There's often a specific kind of exhaustion that builds not just physical tiredness, but a deeper identity-level fatigue, where you start to lose track of what you actually want because you've spent so long calibrating around what everyone else needs. And at some point, usually quietly, usually without fanfare, something in you just stops. Not dramatically, not with a big blow-up, just a quiet, internal, I can't keep doing this. And that moment, as small and undramatic as it feels, is actually the beginning of one of the most important shifts an empath can go through. Because what happens next is usually not what people expect. You'd think choosing peace would feel light immediately, freeing, almost euphoric. But for most empaths, The first stage of choosing peace over obligation feels like grief. It feels like mourning a version of yourself you thought you were supposed to be. The endlessly giving one, the one who never lets anyone down, the one who holds everyone else together even while quietly falling apart. Letting go of that identity, even when it was hurting you, even when it was never sustainable, still feels like losing something. And this is exactly why so many empaths get stuck halfway through this shift. They start setting a boundary, feel the grief and guilt that comes with it, mistake that discomfort for proof that they're doing something wrong, and swing right back into the old pattern of obligation, just to make the uncomfortable feeling go away. But here's the thing that changes everything once you actually understand it. That discomfort isn't a signal that you're doing something wrong. It's a signal that you're doing something your nervous system has never practiced before. Boundaries feel unsafe to a conditioned empath, not because boundaries are actually dangerous, but because your body has spent years associating disappointing someone with the threat of abandonment or conflict. The discomfort is old wiring firing off an outdated alarm. It is not evidence that peace is the wrong choice. It's evidence that you're finally doing something different than the pattern that's been running your life on autopilot. And this is where a lot of people who talk about empaths get it slightly wrong, because they frame the whole journey as simply learning to say no. But that's only the surface of it. The real shift, the one that actually sticks, isn't about learning a new set of words to use in conversations. It's about slowly, repeatedly, proving to your own nervous system that disappointing someone will not end you. That the sky does not fall when you choose your own capacity over someone else's comfort. That people who truly value you will not disappear the moment you stop overfunctioning for them. Every single time you choose peace and the world doesn't collapse, a tiny bit of that old wiring gets rewritten. And it takes repetition. It takes doing it scared over and over, until eventually it stops feeling scary at all. There's also something else happening underneath this shift that deserves real attention. Something a little uncomfortable to sit with. Because when an empath starts choosing peace, it doesn't just change their own life. It changes the relationships around them. Sometimes in ways that reveal exactly who those relationships were built on in the first place. And that's where things get really telling. Because the people who only valued you for what you gave them are going to react very differently to your new boundaries than the people who valued you for who you actually are. That distinction, once it starts showing up in real time, changes everything about how you see the people in your life. That's exactly where we're headed next. Let's sit with that idea for a second, because it's one of the most quietly devastating and clarifying parts of this whole journey. When an empath starts choosing peace, when they start setting boundaries and protecting their energy instead of handing it out on demand, something happens that most people never see coming. The relationships in their life start to sort themselves almost automatically into two very distinct categories. And you don't have to force this sorting. You don't have to test anyone or issue ultimatums. All you have to do is simply stop overextending yourself and watch who stays. The first category is the people who adjust. Maybe not instantly, maybe with a little friction at first, a little confusion even, but they adjust. They respect the new response time. They stop expecting you to drop everything. They start asking how you're doing instead of just what you can do for them. These are the people whose connection to you was never actually built on your exhaustion. They liked you. They valued your company, your perspective, your presence, not just your usefulness. And here's the quietly beautiful part. A lot of empaths are shocked to discover just how many relationships fall into this category once they finally test the waters. Because for years they assumed everyone needed the overfunctioning version of them to stay close. Turns out, a lot of people were just relieved to finally interact with the real you instead of the performance. But then there's the second category, and this is the one that stings because it reveals something that was probably true the whole time, just hidden under the constant giving. These are the people who don't adjust, the ones who get cold or irritated or subtly punishing the moment you stop being endlessly available. The ones who suddenly have a lot to say about how you've changed, how you used to be so much more understanding, how you're being selfish now, when really all that happened is you stopped absorbing the cost of the relationship by yourself. And here's the hard truth underneath this. Their frustration isn't actually about missing you. It's about missing what you provided. The free emotional labor, the bottomless patience, the guaranteed yes. When that disappears, what's left exposed is a relationship that was never really about you as a person at all. This is often the most painful discovery an empath makes on this journey, more painful, honestly, than the exhaustion that led them here in the first place. Because it's one thing to be tired. It's another thing entirely to realize that some of the people you gave the most to were only ever there for what you gave, not for who you are. And I want to be really clear about something here, because this realization can easily curdle into something bitter or self-blaming if you let it. This isn't proof that you were foolish for giving so much. It's not proof that your empathy was a weakness. It's simply information. Painful, clarifying information about where your energy was actually being received and where it was just being consumed. So what do you do with that information once you have it? This is where the real transformation starts to take shape, because choosing peace over obligation isn't just about protecting your time or your energy in isolated moments. It's about slowly, deliberately redesigning who gets access to you at all. And this is a much harder shift than simply saying no to a single request, because it means confronting a belief that a lot of empaths carry without ever examining it. The belief that their empathy is supposed to be unconditional, available to anyone who needs it, regardless of whether that person has ever reciprocated even a fraction of that care. Here's the truth that changes everything once it actually lands. Empathy is not meant to be a public utility. It was never supposed to be something you owe to every person who asks for it, regardless of how they treat you, regardless of whether they've ever shown up for you in return. Real, sustainable empathy is something you extend deliberately to people who've earned the trust of your energy, not something you're obligated to hand out simply because you're capable of feeling deeply. And once an empath truly internalizes that distinction, something shifts permanently. The guilt that used to show up every time they said no starts to quiet down, because they're no longer operating from the belief that their empathy belongs to everyone. They're operating from the understanding that their empathy belongs to them first, and they get to choose where it goes. Now, I want to address something that comes up constantly in this conversation, because it's usually the exact fear that keeps empaths stuck in obligation long after they've intellectually understood everything we've just talked about. And that fear sounds like this. If I stop giving so much, will I turn into someone cold? Someone who doesn't care anymore? This fear is incredibly common, and it's also almost entirely unfounded, because choosing peace over obligation doesn't require you to stop caring. It requires you to stop caring at the expense of yourself. There is an enormous difference between an empath who has walled off their heart out of exhaustion and bitterness, and an empath who has simply learned to extend care with boundaries intact. The first is a shutdown. The second is maturity. And the empaths who make it through this shift successfully almost always describe the same thing on the other side. They don't feel less caring. They feel like they finally have enough of themselves left over to actually enjoy caring, instead of being drained by it. There's one more thing worth naming here, because it's the quiet, unglamorous engine behind all of this. Peace, real peace, is not the absence of relationships or obligations. It's the presence of choice. It's waking up and knowing that whatever you give today, you're giving because you want to, not because some old fear-based wiring is forcing your hand. That distinction sounds small, but it changes everything about how giving actually feels. Obligation drains you because it's involuntary. Choice, even when it involves effort, even when it involves showing up for someone in a real and demanding way, doesn't drain you the same way, because it's coming from a full place instead of an empty one. So if you're in that place right now, staring at a message, feeling that old familiar guilt creeping in for wanting a little space, I want you to hear this clearly. That guilt is not the truth. It's an old alarm built in a different time for a different reason, and it does not get the final say over how you spend your energy anymore. Peace isn't selfish. Peace is what finally lets your empathy come from strength instead of fear. And once you feel that difference, even once, you will never want to go back to the old way again. If this spoke to something you've been quietly carrying for a long time, you're not the only one, and this is exactly the kind of thing we dig into every week here. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next.